Okay, we're going to start now. And for those who missed my opening remarks, just to let you know that unfortunately, Geeta Kapoor, who's to moderate the session, is down with flu. So that's why I'm jumping in. And so please pardon any sort of lapses on my part. I'm just going to start with reading what the panel is about, and then I'll read the bios of our panelists here, and then we will start with Gayatri's presentation. The panel is titled "A History of the Curatorial Figure in India, Pre-globalization." This panel will bring to the surface the personal, improvisational, less visible and independent ways in which the curatorial figure encountered context during the pre-globalization period. While we are aware of the role of the curator in and post the 1990s, we felt we should throw light on what transpired before that. This panel will span a period of almost a century. Gayatri Sinha will talk about the 19th century exhibitions that TN Mukharji, a curator at the Indian Museum in Calcutta, was involved in. Nancy Adajania will focus on the proto-curatorial practices of women practitioners, each premised on the principle of self-organization. And Rashmi Devi Sawhney's presentation will explore the figure of the curator through independent cinema and the film society movement in post-independence India. We hope that foregrounding these personal, diverse, and specific histories will help us tell a more nuanced story of modern art in South Asia towards a better understanding of contemporary curatorial practice in the present. Gayatri Sinha is the founder-director of Critical Collective, a knowledge portal on Indian visual culture. She has edited Voices of Change, 20 Indian Artists from Mark in 2010, Art and Visual Culture in India, 1857 to 2007 for Mark Publications, Indian Art, an Overview for Rupa Books in 2003, Woman Goddess in 1998, Expressions and Evocations, Contemporary Indian Women Artists of India for Mark Publications in 1996. She has curated and lectured extensively in India and internationally, including at the NGMA, the Vancouver Art Gallery, the Grand Curtius Museum, Belgium, and at KIAF in South Korea. She has written monographs on the artists Krishan Khanna, Adi Mulam, and Himmat Shah, and served as visiting professor at JNU, Lady Shri Ram College, and the Dr. Bhawdaji Lal Museum. She is a recipient of a Ford Foundation grant and a Tate Asia Research grant. She recently edited The Archival Gaze, a timeline of photography in India from the 1840s to 2020, and Points of View, Defining Moments of Photography in India, published by TN. Gayatri, do you have the books here?
No.
Or maybe you can bring it tomorrow. Yeah. Nancy Adajania is a cultural theorist and curator based in Bombay. She was joint artistic director of the 9th Gwangju Biennale, South Korea, in 2012. She's curated a number of path-breaking exhibitions, including most recently, Woman Is as Woman Does, courtesy as NVS Museum with GNA in 2022. A first ever intergenerational mapping of the works of Indian women, artists, filmmakers, and activists against the backdrop of the women's movement in India. Adajania's other major research exhibitions include the retrospectives of artists Navjot Altaf, Sudeep Patwardhan, Mary Gogai, and Denny Segna. Adajania has proposed several new theoretical models through extensive writings on subaltern art, media art, public art, collaborative art, transcultural art, and the Biennale culture in the global south. For more than 2 decades, she's written on the practices of women artists of several generations by deploying a transdisciplinary approach that melds art history, feminist theory, anthropology, activism, and philosophy. And finally, Rashmi Devi Sawhney is an associate arts professor of film and new media at New York University in Abu Dhabi. Her work is based in interdisciplinary approaches to cinema, media, visual arts, and cultural practices. She has previously taught at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, JNU, Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland, and the Srishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology, Bangalore. She is co-founder of Vision Mix, an international platform for artists, filmmakers, and researchers, Exhibitions curated include Video Vortex 11, held at the Mill Hall in Kochi in collaboration with Aradhana Seth's House of Inquiry, Goa, and Lost in Transients with Lucia Imaskin at the Hongao Museum in Taipei. Her video installation, Drift City, was shown as part of the Sherry High Could Be Urbanism, curated by architect Naveen Mohantesh at Coach in December 2019. Publications include The Vanishing Point, Moving Images After Video for Tulika Books 2022, Women at Work, The Cultural and Creative Industries, Artist Moving Image, South Asian Trajectories, and South Asian Science Speculative Fiction. So without further ado, I'm just mindful of time. I'm going to ask Gayatri. You've got 20 minutes, and I will give you an indication maybe at 4.
Thank you. My paper today is about Trilokanath Mukhopadhyay, or TN Mukharji as he was known. His dates are 1847 to 1919. And he wanders into the era of spectacle in the late 19th century, an era of amplified hubris, spectacular display, not very much unlike our own. To the reader of Bengali fiction, he is renowned as the author of fantastic and comic stories. His work is translated by Rabindranath Tagore. Shweta Devi, in an interview to Radha Chakravarti, speaks of his phenomenal influence on her. He's also well known to Sukumar Roy, and they have writerly exchanges. In short, he belongs to the Bengali literary elite. For the art historian like Supriya Georgi, who has done extensive work on the festivals and fairs of the 19th century, TN Mukherjee is, quote, an important and neglected witness who spent a lifetime documenting Indian botanical, agricultural, and crafts products for museums and exhibitions, close quote. For our times, I think, and I wanted to dredge up this history because it is something that has fascinated me for a very long time. He serves as an exemplar who sought to champion the Indian art practitioner even under a hostile or at least a repressive regime. As an expert on opium as well, which was one of his other talents, TN Mukherjee advised the British government on its shipments to China. So there was this, this ballast of different kinds of interests in his career. Mukherjee was appointed as assistant curator in the Indian Museum, Calcutta in 1887, the first such curatorial appointment in India. But even prior to this appointment, he had put together very important exhibitions representing Indian arts in the context of empire. What I hope to emphasize in this paper today and my further research is the frequently ambivalent nature of his participation in imperial projects. And more importantly, how enduring has been this template that was put in place and which we will find is still being replicated in 20th and 21st century Indian art institutions. TN Mukherjee was propelled into a position of prominence as a curator with seemingly little or no preparation. After all, he had a background in agriculture, opium, and botanical products. But how do we learn about his participation in the art world? Sometime in 2013, Prithviraj Biswas, a research fellow at CSSS in Kolkata, found an album of photographs in the College of Art Library in Calcutta. This album had somehow survived a great fire. These were the photo document of the 1883 exhibition that TN Mukherjee had put together, and I wanted to just show you how this was done. This is the pointer. So the building that you see over here is the Calcutta Museum. He's already housed over here. The nomenclature of curator comes 4 years later, but he started working here sometime in the 1860s. Close by also is the College of Art. And here in the Calcutta Maidan, literally across, we don't recognize this water body in Calcutta anymore. He sets up the Calcutta exhibition of 1883. It invites participation from the other colonies, notably Australia and those in East Asia. These reveal the kind of an exhibitionary template that he used and will seem all too familiar even to contemporary audiences. This is the interior of the Jewelry Court and Picture Gallery in the 1883 exhibition. I have used this in something very similar in the book. But what you can see is that there are private participants that he has called upon to participate in this. Now, this was a first because obviously there hadn't been in India an exhibition of this scale, and certainly not with private participation from jewelers in far-flung cities like Bombay. This is a better view of what it looked like. What you will recognize is that, as you see in the Handloom and Handicraft Fair that was instituted in Pragati Maidan, the sections were divided into different states: Punjab, Madras, Gujarat, etc. So the Punjab fort with its emphasis on wood carving, very prominent on your left, and right is the exterior or the grand entrance that he has tried to simulate for the entry into the exhibition. TN Mukherjee was conscious of the nature of the display and the necessity of a certain degree of spectacularism. Perhaps that came with his curatorial brief. So we see in the next image, this is the great Osler fountain. The Osler fountain, which comprised thousands of little glass parts, which you would have read about because it was one of the great presentations, I think in 1856 or 51, one of 1851, in the British exhibition, the Great Exhibition of 1851, which brings together colony, which announces Britain's imperial presence also as a source of economic exchange. So this Osler fountain is actually brought to Calcutta and set on display and then dismantled piece by piece and returned to Britain. Mukherjee begins his career as a second master in the education department in Bengal. By this time, the Universal Exposition of 1851 and 1855 had established the popularity of this kind of exhibit. The kind of flamboyance, the kind of arrangement, the kind of we're talking about this in the pre-globalization era, but these fairs demonstrate a different kind of global art exchange. They've become overwhelmingly popular, and Indians going abroad leave their sort of notes and travelogues on this. As a 17-year-old in Paris in 1878, Rabindranath Tagore spoke of the nervous exhaustion he felt after viewing the Paris exhibition, in which 16 million people had paid to view curiosities. The fairs were also, a mark of the wondrous, the curious, the odd, the fantastical, and all meant to stimulate the British appetite for curiosity, even as commerce went on side by side. There were new inventions at the fair which Rabindranath saw, like the telephone. There was also a black village of 400 inhabitants from Africa, or, as Supriya says, a human zoo. Such exhibitions were common in Europe and fed into what Supriya Chaudhary calls the exhibitionary apparatus of the colonial state, calculated to display racial superiority, emboldened by the perception of superior scientific and industrial knowledge. Now, like Gandhi later, Tagore was to emphatically reject this exhibitionary model and the commodity culture of such fairs. TN Mukherjee now follows the contours, after all, he's an employee of this kind of exchange. But he also puts on record his dismay and unease at the gaze that is cast on the participants of the fairs from India. It is this condition of doubt where he reveals a kind of a nascent modernity, an alignment with the growing spirit of nationalism which is growing at home. More importantly, coming at the close of the age of the Holocene. So I didn't know what would be, the age of the Holocene particularly, but apparently by the 1950s, many of you would know this a lot better than I do. By the 1950s, we seem to have moved into the age of the Anthropocene. This is something that's been challenged. Scientists say we're still not in the age of the Anthropocene. I'm not sure. But certainly the age of the Holocene was around the 1950s. So what he's doing in his private capacity is to anticipate the significant loss of material wealth through extractive uses. Across the half a dozen major exhibitions of Indian objects that he curates, Mukherjee is able to assess that as instruments of revenue generation, which is what they were supposed to do, the exhibitions did not reverse the terrible economic decline that was facing India. And this was something that was, of course, fueling nationalist sentiment. And almost as a counter, in fact, he creates a personal collection of raw materials. TN Mukherjee served on several Indian exhibitions. They come in a spate, and his career as an organizer and curator becomes extraordinarily busy from the 1880s. Carol Breckenridge writes about the exhibitions emanating from India as comprising robes, crowns, jewels, thrones, and weapons. Close quote. And they're all set in these kinds of fabulous, sort of palatial sort of settings. I mean, if you look at the Frieze Art Fair, there's one long tent, but this is the kind of fair that was being organized 100 years ago. The first exhibition that Mukherjee sent to Melbourne in 1881, this is Paris. Oh, yes. The International Exhibition in Melbourne, 1881. And what he sends here includes Azamgarh silk, ivory carvings, Benares brassware, cotton and woolen carpets, perfume from Jaunpur, jewelry from Lucknow, Moradabad inlaid metalware, and Agra stoneware. Now, these are very loaded categories because they must be seen within the rubric of the traditional, but they are not considered scientific. Yet, by way of comparison, I thought this is something we should know that the Venice Biennale is instituted. We have the first exhibitions and the coming together of Italy in the 1860s, first major exhibitions in the 1880s. By 1895, when the Venice Biennale is instituted, they start to feel they need something more commercial. So they turn to the decorative arts. By the early 1900s, Murano glass, painted slipware on ceramics, etc., is absolutely rampant in those places. Mukherjee then selected exhibitions for the 1883 exhibition in Amsterdam, Indian Art at the Melbourne exhibition. This you can see the kind of display that was taking place at that time. You get a pavilion and you fill it up with wonderful goods. Amsterdam as another flamboyant kind of placing of a temporary space, factories in the background, large vistas to be seen, but crammed with commercial products. This was in 1883, and very quickly then he moves into the 1883 exhibition in Calcutta. This really establishes his reputation as a man of many devices. So obviously there is a huge amount of travel going around at this time. He brings together Pune figures for the Bombay court, 1883. This typology of figures, which we now see a little bit of it in the Bhavdaji Lad, what does the foreign look like? For this kind of gaze, this was very important. And we should remember that these exhibitions were sending material backward and forward. So what took place in Calcutta would then later travel to Australia. The Lucknow figures in this kind of, Bombay and Lucknow crammed together over here in this kind of diorama. Mukherjee brought in students from the Government College of Art as apprentices. Think of how useful that would have been, and think of coaching in this context. He hung the show as per the different states, Punjab, Bengal, etc., a practice followed by Venice till date. Given his successes in Amsterdam and Calcutta in 1883, Mukherjee was appointed as an expert to the 1886 Colonial and Indian exhibition. This is one of the views of the Calcutta exhibition. You can't see it extremely well, but here are your Jaipur vases. Here is a Burmese, I think it's a funerary object. And here is your paper mache elephant. So it's all crammed in and made to look grand and marvelous. After this, he's appointed, because of the success of this, to the 1886 exhibition. This is the largest one, and by now, India is certainly the jewel in the crown of Britain. And the entire exhibition is devoted to India. It's very important that at this time they were talking about Indian arts as being crafts. But because there are no other countries here, they call Indian art over here fine art. For which he started and traveled across. When he sets this up, he also then travels across Europe for a year, speaking on Indian arts, lecturing, and finally, putting together material for his travelogue. Industrial Europe was at the pinnacle of world civilization at this point. And the marker of civilizational value was undoubtedly industrial progress. So a certain temporality, a certain typology, the fixing of the Orientalist view of India is very strong. In terms of exhibitions, we should understand that the following decade is really critical, the 1880s. In 1885, the Congress is formed. It will soon, critique what they call the drain of wealth. These were the works of Dadabhai Nauroji. They will be complaining about the amount of material that's flowing out of the coffers of India, the kind of wealth, etc. they decide to hold their own exhibitions. So from 1901 to 1906, the Congress holds exhibitions in Bombay, Ahmedabad, etc. It is a binary that, in a way, we can locate in Mukherjee, because this is what he's also anticipated. There is the exhibition in Europe that marks the height of empire and commerce, and then there is the nascent Congress, which brings about the values of Swadeshi. The idea of the world as microcosm, as we see in Britain at the fair, which is supposed to include the best of everything and leave out what is not so great. And then there is the values that are adapted for the home country to encapsulate the nation as exhibition. So the world is now replaced by nation, and that is really what the Congress exhibitions aim for. These events conjoin to create a shifting exhibitionary space, one of an aspiration for commerce on the one hand and the growing nationalist sentiment on the other. Mukherjee flags collaboration and admiration for the imperial systems, but also a huge amount of colonial resistance. Traveling around England and Europe for a year, he was to bemoan the representation of Indians in museums. He says, quote, the museums in Europe, where ethnographical specimens from all parts of the world have been collected, bring to the mind of an Indian a feeling of humiliation and sorrow. So that is his response to Indian representation. With his background in agriculture, he wanted to push for other means of production, probably hoping to stem the decline in Indian agricultural produce. With his interventions in catalogs, etc., as Supriya Chaudhary writes, he undercut the grand imperial statements by inserting glimpses of the poorest classes of cultivator and craftsperson. This question of agency is something that actually runs through his practice, and I think it brings us to the present day. Repeatedly, he speaks of lost arts, the weaving of dhaka muslin, the inlay work in Mongair. He says there will be 6 or 8 practitioners. All of the others of their, ilk have now gone to lay the railways across Bihar. He also recommends a proposal to make paper. So he's thinking in an entrepreneurial way, which will use Indian materials. Ooh. Since this is a short presentation, there are only 2 or 3 aspects of Mukherjee's curatorial template that need to be highlighted. The first is the issue of the body of the artist as exhibitionary model, and the long shadow that was to cast on Indian future museums well into the 21st century. Homi Bhabha speaks of the ambivalence of colonial discourse and its vulnerability to being problematized by the colonized. Mukherjee finds himself at the center of this ambivalence. If we look at these displays, which we are showing you from the 1886 exhibition, which Saloni Mathur has written about, there is an understanding that not everything is what meets the eye. Carpet weaving courtyard in the India Palace in the Colonial and Indian Exhibition of 1886, and an Indian section of the Colonial and Indian Exhibition again over here, where they are making their wares. But as she points out, there is a mythic interpretation of India at this point. The exhibition would lay out images of Indian palaces, paintings of Indian princes, all mimicking the royal residence. But the performers themselves were jailbirds from Agra, who had been trained to weave or to fry jalebis, as may be, and therefore they represent a kind of a typology without being the actual person who was responsible for this. Meera, I can take 2 minutes more. Yeah. So these occupy the artisans that travel to these sites occupy 2 principal sites: the outwear court and the economic court. In the outwear court, this is the kind of scene that you would have encountered of the actual making, sitting in front of the people and actually making this. And then there was the economic sphere where they would be herded into simulations of villages, the Zulus, the Indians, the Native Americans, where people would come and stare at them. TN Mukherjee's response was angry, and he didn't go. It is not that it wasn't heard, because his catalogs become hugely popular and they are reprinted. He says, quote, a dense crowd always stood there looking at our men as they wove the gold brocade. They wove the carpets or printed the calico. They were very interesting beings, no doubt. So were the Zulus, and so is the Indian chief at this present time. Close quote. He was also sensitive not only to the mechanics of display, but that the import of goods was impoverishing India. Now, like Rabindranath Tagore, there was a huge outcry as this information of how things were when the information trickled in. Jawaharlal Nehru was the first to protest and said in 1908 that you are creating a typical Indian village in the Franco-British Fair of London. I shudder to think of what will be in it. A congregation of half-naked people, I should imagine. His elegant shudder was followed by Gandhi's revulsion of what was being represented in the fairs. And we mustn't forget that if the first fair was 1851, by the time we come to Wembley, 70 years have passed. Technology, cinema, radio, etc. are overtaking the world. Opinion formation is much, much faster. And in Wembley, particularly because of a very large Nigerian exhibition of people herded together, there was a tremendous protest. The Indians protested, Gandhi leads the protest, and thereafter there is the cessation of the sending of the artisanal body to these fairs. Now, in conclusion, I'll take 1 minute. How enduring has the exhibitionary model been? One may argue that all the displays of crafts in India, the Crafts Museum is an example, put the artisan on display. It is a faux representation because he may not actually be doing very much over there, but somehow that ethos of a certain freezing of a temporality, the continuous artisan is on view. In 1886, the Indian exhibits were about artisans weaving tapestries. Now, how different is this from the display of the recently founded Nita Mukesh Ambani Center at BKC, where, as you walk down the main concourse, weavers are standing at their looms, weaving Banarsi saris, Kanjivarams, and other things, other objects of consumption. The exhibition of these works is titled Swadesh, much in the manner of the freedom movement. And the weavers' work, even as the gaze must rest on contemporary art objects, family shrines of devotion, chrome, marble, glass. So there is a recontextualization, but there's also a kind of a frozen temporality. If the artisanal body on display was a subject of unease, there were other aspects such as the history of science and material. What TN Mukherji does is to combat this with a personal collection. He puts together 750 samples of raw materials that he believed were threatened. These, unfortunately, are not in India. They were sent to Australia very soon after the collection was made, and that's where they have found their resting place, in the museum at Victoria. The sign of hope, in a certain sense, for TN Mukherji, I'll just conclude this, Meera, I'm sorry, was really the exhibitions that the Indian National Congress starts in 1901. They bring together raw produce, they bring together finished products, they become the makers and the distributors and the receivers of goods rather than the imperial power. So this binary of what can constitute Swadesh, what can constitute Indian materials and products, and what will be used for export is very well established. The content of these Congress exhibitions actually is a wonderful subject for research. There are 2 scholars who have written on them, but there is probably a huge amount of work that went into these. We are only looking at their political meetings over here. But Mukherji's role here is important. He finds himself trapped in a certain sense, but also full of opportunity between this binary. And he plays, interestingly, both sides to come out as possibly the one curator who can negotiate the colonial issue. Thanks.
Thank you, Gayatri. Thank you, Meera, and thank you, Monica, for organizing this curatorial forum. My presentation, as you can see on the slide here, is titled "A Stray Spark Could Burn a Hole, Welding Together Some Proto-Curatorial Histories." The title of my presentation is inspired by the artist Pilu Puchkanawala's audacious remark, "A stray spark could burn a hole in the almost blank chapter of contemporary Indian sculpture." And of course, this audacious remark encoded a certain desire. Only if a stray spark could burn a hole. And within this paper, we will be talking about curatorial desire, even though it's not legitimized in the decades before globalization. Now, my paper will concentrate on 2 proto-curatorial figures: Firoza Godrej, an art historian and institution builder, and the founder of the Simrosa Art Gallery in Bombay in 1971, and the experimental sculptor Pilu Puchkanawala from 1923 to 1986, who inspired younger artists to activate the cultural sphere with open-air exhibitions and multidisciplinary arts festivals. Now, the figure of the independent curator came to be named and acknowledged as such in the Indian context only in the early 1990s. But before the curatorial figure gained legitimacy in the contemporary Indian art world, there were people who had played the role of organizing exhibitions, conceiving critical groups of contributors, cultivating a climate of discussion, and working across exhibition and publication formats. Function precedes figure. There was an independent curator function long before the figure of the independent curator emerged as such. What interests me greatly is the way initiatives were shaped in the Indian art world during the decades before the 1990s. Models of exhibitionary practice, the context in which these models operated, the strategies informing the formation of both voluntary, loose, informal coalitions of people and practices, as well as formal institutional infrastructure for the arts. And the most crucial strategy, that of negotiating between institutions and audiences. I cannot be a neutral observer to the study of this historical context, or more appropriately, context. I grew up in the Bombay art world in the late 80s, early 90s, at the cusp of globalization. My work in cultural theory and curation has been informed by my early socialization in the visual arts, crafts, and film. As a freelance cultural critic for the mainstream media, as the founding programs coordinator of More Crafts at NCBA, and as the alumna of FTI for me. Gayatri just spoke about the artisans being on display during the expos and the fairs, the world fairs. And when I conceived the symposium, I was in my 20s, Should the Crafts Survive? And it was very important for me that we do not have craftspeople sitting in the garden, the well, kind of the kind of garden which is almost anesthetized, and where people are not even allowed to walk on the grass. I do not want the craftspeople to set up their, practices and to be seen as a kind of, zoo animals. Instead, I decided that this symposium would be inaugurated by two artists, and therefore we had Satyanarayan Lalkaran, the middle artist, and the Kalamkari artist, Guru Pachetti. And I requested them to put forward their manifesto for if the crafts survived, how would they want the crafts to survive? What kinds of infrastructures should be put into place for that? Over the years, I have developed prehistories for the biennial form, media art, subaltern art, and the practices of women artists in India. And one of my methods for this is basically the genealogical method. It's a method which has been part of my practice for many years. It's a method of retrieving and contextualizing underrecorded and underregarded art historical moments. And the prehistory of curation before the 1990s in the Indian context was triggered by stray sparks, but also full-fledged conflagrations too hot to handle. I have spent the last 2 decades analyzing the lost histories of transcultural modernism and pushed back the horizon of the contemporary by perforating the canon and looking in the wrong places, sites not legitimized by conventional art history. My ideological commitment is towards demonstrating the prior horizons of a confident globalism that long predates the globalization of the 1990s. To just give 2 examples of proto-curatorial figures from my own writing and curation, one is the commissioner of a national pavilion in a world fair, who enabled various contributors, including artists, designers, photographers, and music composers, to experiment across media and display formats. And second, the founder of the first biennial in India. So Menegal, a multimedia specialist who had worked in radio, television, exhibition design, and print media since the 40s, was the commissioner of the large and immersive photo murals contributed by Krishan Khanna for Asia's first World Fair, the Expo 70 in Osaka in 1970. Krishan had in turn worked with photographer Madan Mahata and the music composer Vanraj Bhatia to make this ambitious installation. Often these commissions for the World Fair were collaboratively curated. I have shown the digital images of these photo murals in Countercanon Counterculture, which I curated in 2019. I retrieved the until then comfortably forgotten history of India's first biennial, the Triennale India 1968, directed by Mulkraj Anand, in my essay Globalism Before Globalization, The Ambivalent Fate of Triennale India, published in 2013. The Triennale emerged from Nehru's non-aligned philosophy as an alternative to the binaries of Cold War politics, and Mulkraj Anand's anti-fascist politics of promoting Afro-Asian solidarity. For a third world country to host an international exposition in the 1960s was a major gesture of decolonization and self-assertion. This retrieval for me is a confidence-building gesture to see ourselves not as latecomers, guests, or gate trashers, but as pioneers, hosts, and catalysts in our own right. Whether in my writing or curation, I resist different forms of interpellation that tell us who we are and what we know or should not know. And instead, I craft my own antecedents and frames of belonging and knowledge. Significantly, the production of these prehistories and assertion of curatorial and discursive agency is crafted from resources of abundance rather than registers of deficit. Over to Firoza Godrej and Pilu Pochkhanawala's proto-curatorial contributions, I would argue that both their contributions are premised on the principle of self-organization. The formative impulse guiding Firoza and Pilu's practices was DIY. Their temperaments, although Firoza is gentle and caring and Pilu was more of a rough diamond, all spark and sharp edges, reflect the Bombay spirit. The people of Bombay respect private enterprise rather than largest from state agencies. I know the Dilliwalas are not going to like this. They are not indebted to cultural mandarins. Instead, their imagination is captivated by charismatic soloists, entrepreneurs who have the courage to walk the razor's edge between risk and profit. A graduate in English literature with a minor in French, Firoza nurtured the desire to be a painter. But realizing the difficulties faced by young artists who have a solo show, Kevald and Pandol Art Gallery had just been founded in the early 60s, but they mainly catered to established artists. Firoza decided to start a gallery for young artists. If Firoza had had her way, she would have opened her Simroza Art Gallery on Independence Day in 1971. After all, she was born in 1948, not quite a midnight's child, but close. As it happens, it was the wrong font that delayed her gallery opening. Having received the letterhead of the gallery in white in an old English font, Pilu sent the 23-year-old gallerist stumbling back to the drawing board. Ironically, it was the senior artist who pointed to the very young gallerist the mismatch between the gallery agenda, that of making a difference in the lives of young artists, and its stuffy branding. Firoza, a quick learner, ran with the reprimand and made a fun font with Anando Kulkarni, where each of the letters of Simroza could double as another letter. The M was also an E, and so forth. We could also read this groovy 1970s font with hints of Art Nouveau as a hybrid sign signaling the less hierarchical popular energies of the flower generation. Firoza was far from being a hippie, but what she hid behind the nice Parsi girl's persona was a quiet, rebellious streak. At such a young age, he saw it as a moral responsibility to add to the cultural infrastructure of the city. Simroza showed art by day and partied by night. Serious fun, of course. Here's rock musician Ronnie Mystery strumming hard. Ronnie who, you'll ask? Rohinton Mistry moved to Canada and gave up music to become a renowned novelist. Indian classical music concerts were also held at Simrosa. They had tabla performances by Zakir Hussain. On the Sarod, they had Brij Narayan. They had the fabulous N. Rajam and many others. Over time, the gallery organically grew into a hub of conversations between artists, poets, playwrights, and filmmakers. Firoza recalls that 5 years since the gallery had opened, IIT Bombay invited Simroza in 1976 to collaborate with them in organizing their Mood Indigo Youth Festival. Simroza's ability to respond to the needs of the youth was catching on. The Simroza Gallery can be seen in the lineage of the Bhulabhai Desai Institute, which was founded in 1946 by Madhuri Desai, 2 years before Firoza was born, and in the same year that the Mar magazine was founded by Mulkraj Anant. At the Bhulabhai, artists like Nasreen Mohammadi, Nalini Malani Hussain, and Tayyab Mehta rented studio spaces at ₹1 a month. Al-Qazi, Vijay Mehta, and Satyadev Dubey rehearsed their plays there, and Ravi Shankar started his music school, Kinnar, as well, in the institute. The transdisciplinary ethos of Simroza left a lasting impression on Firoza. It helped her define and articulate her own non-hierarchical approach to modern and contemporary art. She made it a point not to discriminate between high art and low art. Both her exhibition program and her art collection reflected the democratic attitude. Despite painting being the dominant medium of the day, she encouraged the so-called lesser forms of art, namely prints, ceramics, fiber art, photography, and the crafts, having been inspired by the stellar contributions of Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay and Kupal Jaipur. The art of you have these photography shows, you have a ceramics show by Jyotsna Bhatt. So it's just a glimpse into the kinds of exhibitions that Simroza held. And here you have the Zal Praxis exhibition poster. The art of printmaking was seen as a stepsister of painting well into the 1990s. To remedy this, Firoza collaborated with the artist Akbar Padamsi, the industrialist and art patron Ajay Lakhanpal, and psychotherapist Udayan Patel on the Zal Praxis project to contact printmakers across India and build a platform as well as a portfolio of prints that reflected their experimental acumen. The gallery celebrated its 50 years through a range of exhibitions. I curated the retrospective of the all but forgotten fiber artist Nelly Setna, whose work was collected by Firoza. This is a glimpse of the 20-foot long wall, notes from my research journal from the retrospective, which conveys my research insights into the experimental nature of Nelly's work and the adjacent histories of post-war British design, Nordic modernism, and crafts activism in the Indian context. And Ranjit Hoskote curated Mapping the Lost Spectrum, which showed works from the Godrej collection, which was built alongside the running of the Simroza Gallery and its collaborations with other institutions such as the Crafts Museum Delhi, Bullu Imam Sanskriti Museum and Art Gallery, Hazaribagh, Jharkhand, which engages with the art of the Oraon community. To represent Firoza's eclectic temperament, Hoskote presented paintings by academy-trained artists like A.G. Subramaniam, Manjeet Baba, and S.H. Raza, alongside the works of Kalighat artists as well as Mithila artists from the Dalit community, namely Rajkumar and Bindeshwar Paswan. Ranjit Hoskote and I showed Pilu Pochkandawala and Adira Virwala's sculptures along with Nelly Setna's tapestries and other artistic practices that had long been forgotten in No Parsi is an Island, a curatorial reading across 150 years in 2013 at the NGMA Bombay and later at NGMA Delhi. Pilu wasn't just a woman artist working in a medium dominated by male artists. She was also an artist with an unusual vision. No lyrical flushes, no easy transcendence. was someone who had been in the 1950s inspired by a vocabulary borrowed from the then prevailing holy trinity of sculpture, Moore, Harp, and Hepworth. She soon found her own voice by welding pieces of scrap metal together in a factory in Marole, in a suburb of Bombay. To invoke the elements of nature, earth, fire, water, and wind, in a range of media, from scrap metal to stainless steel to aluminum alloy, with an assured but also an austere ruggedness, was rare in Indian sculpture at that time. In her bleak sculptural landscapes, time corrodes and destroys everything in its wake, and cloudbursts feel at once like nature's fury, but also like residues of an atomic explosion. Pinu did not offer the viewer a facile redemption. Hope, when it did spark, offered hope. When it did spark, offered Belder's torch, was sharp, knifing the air in a brilliant explosion. Spark, a monumental two-story high public sculpture commissioned by the BST, the Mumbai Electric Supply and Transport, and installed in the Haji Ali Circle in Bombay, became Bombay's important landmark, affording much pleasure to the passengers riding by in double-deckers. Yeah. With traffic congestion and road widening, the sculpture was reinstalled and sold for scrap. When Pinu died at the age of 63, she had many unrealized projects. It was a dream that Bombay must have its own National Gallery of Modern Art. In the early 80s, she joined the gallerist and cultural activist Kepu Gandhi to petition for the transformation of the CJ Hall into the Bombay chapter of the NGMA. By then, the CJ Hall had declined from a prestigious venue for the visual and performing arts into a rental venue for boxing matches and clothes sales. While the word curator wasn't current at that time, Pinu expressed her curatorial desire by conceiving and organizing the first transdisciplinary Bombay Arts Festival in 1966. Mrinalini Sarabhai presented her shadow puppets, and Asha Putli mesmerized the audiences with her singing. The festival could not be sustained because of lack of funding. In 1978, she organized an open-air exhibition of her sculptures in her garden in Worli by bringing together visual artists, musicians, dancers, and poets to make presentations on the theme time cycle, which she defined as, and I quote her, the cyclic aspects of life and nature that are at the core of religious and philosophic concepts still very influential in India, close quote. Pinu was very fortunate in having inspired women practitioners who carried her proto-curatorial ideas forward. Firoza learned the ropes of curation from Pinu. While Pinu did not believe in aggressively asserting her nationality, she was constantly asked what is specifically Indian about her sculpture. She did feel the need to assert her subjectivity as a woman artist, not in an illustrative sense of representing the women's issues in her sculptures, but in the sense of taking ownership of the art produced by women artists. She had wanted to organize a women artist show along with Nalini Malani. While that did not materialize in her lifetime, the show did take place in 1987. Through the Looking Glass, self-organized women artist show comprising Nalini Malani, Arpita Singh, Nilima Sheikh, and Madhvi Parekh traveled to Bhopal, Bangalore, Bombay, and Delhi, burning many tiny holes in the consciousness of the Indian art world, which had till then been an old boys' club. Nalini also revived Pinu's Bombay Arts Festival, which had happened in 1966, and they revived it in 1987, a year after Pinu's passing. And Nalini did this in collaboration with Pushpamala, Pritam Patel, and Kaushik Gandhi. And this festival honored Pilu's artistic vision by inviting 19 sculptors, some of whose work reflected expanded sculptural practices. Yeah, I'm wrapping up. The festival also invited theatre groups from Delhi, Pune, and Bombay, a modern dancer, Uttara Asha Purlawala, a classical Indian musician, film directors, and poets who recited the poems in Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, and English. Pilu must have known that women never ignore stray sparks, because depending on how you can contain them, they can either burn holes or start a fire. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to the Anant Art Foundation, to Meera, and all the organizers for putting together this very exciting program. I was kind of very, intrigued when Meera asked me to join the panel talking about the figure of the curatorial figure in pre-globalization India. I can assure you that I was in high school at the turn to globalization, so I'm not going to be able to speak about my own work. But I am going to take the opportunity to put forward a few propositions to this very accomplished audience, and I feel a little bit reassured to see familiar faces in the room. I am going to be talking about cinema, and my apologies to all those who feel that this is perhaps a bit of an intrusion in the space of the visual arts. So my apologies in advance for that. But I thought that after this presentation, I may never be invited to speak at a visual arts forum. And so I thought that I should make the most for it to answer some questions that I have been thinking about for myself in relation to the whole concept of curatorial practice. And I was, in fact, more struck by the fact that Meera used the term the curatorial figure in her description of what she would like the panel to address. And I am taking the liberty of looking at the curatorial figure as a phantom figure. One of the things that I've always been struck by and have wondered is the tremendous confidence that I see curators, young curators in particular, muster in terms of describing or talking about what is the work of curation. And it has never been very clear to me what the work of curation is. It's always been a fuzzy zone. And, the morning's panel, in fact, and my colleagues in this panel also, brought out the messiness of this work of curatorial practice very nicely. So I'm going to kind of, take the liberty of thinking about the curatorial figure, not as the curator, and making the distinction between the curator and the curatorial figure as a curatorial figure who emerges through discursive work and whose subjectivity is being constructed even as we speak. And it seems to me that there's a very strong subjectivity of some kind which is forming as we address the idea of who the curatorial figure is. And this, I think, I find very interesting. And I'm approaching this from I also think about it in relation to the idea of the artist. And I know some of the panels are going to be addressing the point about the artist curator. And historically in literature, there have been so many wonderful imaginations of the artist figure, right? As a melancholic figure, perhaps. The curatorial figure comes across in my limited understanding of the word as a very confident and empathetic figure, from what I've been hearing all of you say. So I wonder what this combination of a empathetic melancholia might produce in some sense. So with that kind of prelude, I'm going to read, and my apologies for that because I personally don't like being read to, but I was very intimidated by this gathering, so I thought I should write my thoughts down before I forget. I'm going to go through 4 sections in a loose way. The first is, of course, this kind of prelude that I'm placing in front of you. The second is that I'm going to lay out a bit of a context of the film society movement, which may be very familiar to 50% of this room, and some of you have participated in it. and maybe completely unheard of to the other 50%. And I hope that it gives you some kind of context to all the histories. And I'm then going to talk about one particular individual from within this film society movement who is not the person who we would generally associate this movement with, which would be, Chidananda Das Gupta, Shatiji Ray, and so many others. But I'm actually going to talk about Khaja Ahmad Abbas. And I think he would be very uncomfortable if I try to locate him as a curatorial figure, but I'm going to take that liberty in any case, and then conclude with some propositions which I want to place out into this room, and particularly from my younger colleagues in this room in terms of how you respond to historicizing the work of curatorial practice in a South Asian context, and how uncomfortable you feel about looking back at film histories. And Meera, please.
Yeah,
stop.
I'll keep you honest. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So this is a famous photograph of Satyajit Ray with his biographer, Marie Seton, and one of the main agents in terms of establishing the film society movement in India. And I'm going to leave that sort of on the screen there for you to ruminate over as if it were an intricate piece of art. So the curatorial figure, as opposed to a curator, is a phantom figure, a figment of the imagination, which I'm going to use here as a conceptual prompt. This rather liberating framing allows me to enter the discussion through the medium of cinema, and as I've said, I beg the pardon of colleagues who are dismissing outrages, but I hope that I can offer some thoughts that are relevant to both cinema studies and art history. In sharing these ideas, I proposed a tentative concept of an expanded exhibition that stretches or sometimes compresses the time-space coordinates across which curatorial interventions might unfold. While in art, history and criticism, the curator's ancestry isn't burdened with ambiguity. We got several definitions, emerged through the morning of care and otherwise. The narrative available in the context of cinema, that of the archivist or custodian with an encyclopedic knowledge in the manner of Henri Langlois at the Paris Cinematique or P.K. Nair at the National Film Archive of India, is only partially representative of subcontinental curatorial figures and the histories of their work. So the ability to identify, salvage, and bring out rare gems for display is important, but perhaps a conservative view of the work of film curation, and there may be some value for us film scholars to learn from art historians on this occasion. Taking the invitation to think about curatorial figures excluded from classical accounts or indeed formulations, I present a brief reflection on the film society movement in India, focusing on Khaja Ahmad Abbas, who has been described as a journalist, writer, filmmaker, but never as a curator. And he certainly didn't see himself as one. But in my narrative, he's the phantom figure who might be able to shed some light on the nature of curatorial work. There's an implicit understanding within the world of the arts about what the work of curation entails, which includes, as again the morning panel made very clear, cutting the umbilical cord with the curator's ancestral origins, the rejection of the parental caretaker's role, and the acquisition of a subjectivity quite distinctly intellectual, with a social commitment which in the pre-globalization times that we are discussing on this panel could safely be assumed to be left-leaning. However, unlike the work of a doctor or an architect, the curatorial figure's work is hard to define or limit. It lies in the production of a surplus, but unlike an artist or filmmaker, it is a surplus often produced through the work of others. And so the curatorial figure must do something in addition to what the artist or filmmaker has done, which involves a pedagogic and performative element. I feel somewhat compelled to offer a very brief comment on the question, is cinema art? And I put cinema in brackets because you can substitute cinema with any other new technologized form, and the question gets asked repeatedly, is it art? I don't think it's necessary to rehash the familiar counters of this debate amongst this accomplished audience, but let me address some broad narratives as they played out within the film society movement itself. We have a poster here of a Bergman Film Festival organized by the Suchitra Film Society in 1972. And there were many such programs, the history of which we are now beginning to kind of encounter through some important work that has appeared in recent times, which is a book by Rachna Mazumdar and a book by V.K. Cherian, looking at these histories. So, Rachna Mazumdar's book, Art, Cinema, and India's Forgotten Futures, and which focuses mainly on the West Bengal context, and a revised edition of V.K. Cherian's book on the Film Society movement, which offers a broader but more snapshot version of a pan-Indian view of this movement. So the Film Society movement begins during colonial times, but kind of really flourishes in post-independence India, and it's invested in the question of taste, which cinema, of course, has always been, has not been able to be delinked from. So, the core value was of the Film Society movement was to encourage a certain kind of aesthetic sensibility, right, and to suture cinemas, particularly popular cinemas, link with the masses and kind of popular taste. So, one of the first film societies that was set up post-independence was set up in Calcutta in 1947, followed by multiple societies across Bombay, Delhi, Trivandrum, Patna, Roorkee, and many other cities. And pioneers of the movement include Chidananda Das Gupta, Marie Setos, Adajit Ray, Satish Batul, Vijaya Mule, Atul Gopal Krishnan, P.K. Nair. It was predominantly a male-dominated movement with some involvement of women, and there are very, very detailed accounts in terms of the audiences who showed up for these screenings. What was the membership structure of the membership like? Who were the members of the society and so on? So these details are available. Of course, I don't have the time to go into all of this in my presentation. But for those of you who might be interested in knowing about these histories, they're available in the two books that I just mentioned. The members often included artists, writers, journalists, filmmakers, diplomats, working professionals, and working class persons. And the state was not absent from this mix. And Cherian in particular addresses Indira Gandhi's involvement with the formation of the societies at great length, including describing in great detail several instances where films which were censored in India were actually given special screen permission, on the directive of Mrs. Gandhi. So in addition to the screening of international and independent films, and these are some descriptions of screenings, you can obviously read them, my apologies, but there were a number of very interesting films which were acquired with a great deal of labor, great deal of networking. So the societies functioned absolutely in the context of collaboration and negotiation with the state, as well as other kinds of patrons. So in addition to the screening of international and independent films, the societies were committed to hosting discussions and debates, and writing or publication was a significant aspect of their work. Magazines and film journals were established in several Indian languages, creating a vibrant intellectual climate. And one of the things that I have often thought about as a film studies person myself is really the transition from this kind of film society movement, the cinephilia, a collaborative engagement with cinema as a social contract, into film studies as a discipline, and the strange way in which many of these journals and magazines suddenly disappear. Right? Yeah, and I'm not saying it is not a comment on film studies, it is a comment in terms of the social contract of cinema in some sense. So statistics tell us that the number of societies grew from 6 in 1948 to 219 in 1981. And those statistics are mentioned after 1981 because this is the point when the society movement kind of starts disintegrating. So, and under the Federation of Film Societies, they took on a strong pedagogic mandate, namely to expose Indians to a wide range of good films in order to cultivate an aesthetic sensibility and to nurture future filmmakers. So in a sense, they didn't see themselves as a pedagogic site, in the absence of or along with formal educational institutions such as the FTI, which was formed in the set up in the 16th. So the question of cinema as art was taken up by the Film Society members in an aesthetic manner, and Rachana Mazumdar suggests that this later transforms into a political question during the 60s and 70s, early 70s in West Bengal, and she, kind of maps out the conditions which lead to this, which is of course one of them is the partition of East and West Pakistan, and then the Naxalite movement. But there were, of course, other stories unfolding elsewhere, including in the big bad world of Bombay cinema, where K. Abbas was greatly influenced by the Indian People's Theatre Association, had directed in 1945 a film called Dharti Ke Lal on the 1943 Bengal famine. The film is considered among the pioneers of social realism in Indian cinema, and there were debates about whether social realism was a form that was artistic enough to be called art, and many such debates. With actors, the film drew actors from the IPTA and depicted the changing socio-economic conditions during the Second World War, the loss of humanity, and the struggle for survival. The film, which is based on Bijon Bhattacharya's play Nobana and Krishan Chandra's Annadatta, precedes Satyajit Ray's Pather Panchali by 12 years, which of course, as we know, is considered by some as the film making, marking the rebirth of Indian cinema, and certainly the film which finds central place in the narrativized histories of the Film Society movement in most accounts. So Abbas was born in 1914 in Panipat in undivided Punjab, and was a journalist, writer, director, and producer. He came from a progressive Muslim family. His paternal grandfather, Khwaja Sajad Hussain, was a poet and had established the first school for girls in Panipat. His career was extraordinarily prolific. He was involved with about 50 films across documentary fiction and short films as writer, director, producer, and his newspaper column, The Last Page, which he started in the Bombay Chronicle, and which was published as Azad Kalam in the Urdu version, and he wrote in multiple languages, was among the longest running political columns in India's history, published from 1935 until his death in 1987. He published 74 books in English, Urdu, Hindi, including novels, non-fiction, poetry, and short stories. And in 1951, he started his own studio, Naya Sansar, directing landmark films like Sheher Aur Sapna. In 1963, Bombay Raat Ki Baahon Mein, 67, which was a film that launched Persis Khambata. He wrote the script for Chetan Anand's Neecha Nagar in 46, along with many of Raj Kapoor's films, including Avara in 51, Shri 420 in 55, Jagte Raho in 56, Meera and Joker in 70, and even Bobby in 1973. Abbas was an active member of the Film Society movement, invested in debates around quality and taste, but chose to work across a wide range of genres, formats, and mediums. In 1969, he filed a petition in the Supreme Court of India seeking the complete ban on censorship on grounds that it was unconstitutional. His argument was that pre-censorship was in contradiction of constitutional rights, and the order issued by Justice Siddharthullah in the Khwaja Ahmad Abbas versus the Union of India matter on 24th September 1970 reads as follows. This is the description of what the petition was about. The petitioner made a documentary film called A Tale of Four Cities, which attempted to portray the contrast between the life of the rich and the poor in the four principal cities of this country. The film included certain shots of a red light district in Bombay. Although the petitioner applied to the Board of Film Censors for a U certificate for unrestricted exhibition of the film, he was granted a certificate only for exhibition restricted to adults. On an appeal made to it by the petitioner, the central government issued a direction on 3rd July 1969 that a U certificate may be granted provided certain specified cuts were made in the film. So he managed to get the U certificate, but provided he would make some, cuts. And he determined not to make any cuts in the film, and of course, we know many filmmakers who followed in that footstep. for those footsteps. Abbas filed a petition seeking a complete ban on film censorship. The bench headed by Justice Hidayatullah rejected Abbas's petition on grounds that the cinema was special, that is, in need of strict control by the state by virtue of its seductive sensory qualities combining theatre, music, live action, literary narratives, and so on. This was not the last attempt by a filmmaker to oppose censorship, and that battle is far from won. However, I locate this particular act of resistance by Abbas as a curatorial performance, and of course, we all have the liberty of charting our narratives of or historicizing what we understand as curatorial intervention. I have been hearing the word subversion very frequently in discussions on curatorial practice, rupture, dissonance, and I see Abbas's filing of the petition as a real act of subversion that is actually engaging with the state. So I want to return to the question that frames my inquiry: what is the work of curation? And this is my concluding sort of 1 to 2 minutes. Done? So in an interview with Paul O'Neill, who you all know only too well in Delhi, says, my role as a curator is as somebody who's intellectually interested in art. And I would add to that cinema, photography, new media, broader understanding of the arts, and the meanings that it produces and how one can organize it within the limited institutional space of the gallery or the public space within which art is presented. It is an intellectual practice. The responsibility of the curator, insofar as working with ideas that are made elsewhere, is an interpretive one as well as performative. It's not only responsiveness to the forms or ideas of the work, but responsiveness to the very historical conditions under which art is being produced. Making an exhibition is a way to engender new ways of looking at the deep entanglements between art, society, and its institutions, and the ways in which all of the residues of the encounter between the public, art, and institutions are registered in the context of historical narration. I think the curator has to be alert to all these formidable edifices that impede our ability to be open to other type of work. So I want to end with this note and so open the questions in terms of I see Abbas's work as ticking all the boxes that in this instance have been described as being curatorial work, but in other cases too, the understanding of curatorial work, which is, and of course the work of the Film Society movement, which falls more within the traditional kind of explanation of what curatorial practice might be in terms of screening unseen films, screening new works, screening. Right? So departing from the historical model of screening of films as kind of the lineage of film curation in some sense, I'd like to address this question or pose the question or throw open the question of what else can we learn from art historians in this instance while thinking about the history of film curation in the rather exciting way in which curatorial practice is being thought about today in the world of the contemporary arts. In terms of what does the work of film curation entail beyond showing films, holding discussions, exposing people to a wider range of practices, because this is the older tradition of understanding film curation. And I sort of want to the title of my presentation was called From the Film Society to the Film Curator. And I wonder what that transition actually means in terms of working practices, because the work of film curation today, particularly in the context of very large festivals, as we see, has taken on an entirely different nature, which is of being present, being present in many international film festivals and knowing what has been made. And I wonder if there is a way of pushing that a little kind of out of its comfort zone, if I may say so, and thinking about these more political histories that we witnessed in the 20th century and looking at unlikely, unusual curatorial figures in their phantom sense in that sense. Thank you.
I'm going to throw this very quickly to the house, because in the morning I noticed that we didn't have that much time for questions, but I did have, maybe we can have some lights here. to Gayatri, and also coming back to what Rashmi mentioned and what we talked about in the morning, curation as subversion, how things as curators create rupture, you know, and how can we support the frameworks or templates we are in. And I coming to you guys, you did mention about Mukherjee and his deep unease with the exhibitions that he was doing. You did talk about his collection, to Australia. Maybe can you talk a bit about how he expressed? I mean, we know that he wrote and said that, but what were the other ways in which he expressed his unease?
Yeah, thank you. I didn't get to the end of my visual presentation, which actually had the samples. We had images of what he'd collected in the bottles and done painstakingly across the length and the breadth of the country. That was one thing. TN Mukherjee actually made catalogs for every exhibition that he curated. So whether it was Amsterdam or Paris or Melbourne or the two major exhibitions in Kolkata as well as in Britain, he made elaborate, long catalogs which actually serve. They come in the line of Birdwood, etc., about the materials and art manufacture of India. And he places these on record about what were the kinds of crafts, what were the kind of materials that were available, and that art manufacturers of India, the book that he puts out, becomes a sort of a Bible with a huge readership. Within the first 3 months, it goes into the second edition. I mean, all of us are writers, we'd love that. TN Mukherjee beat you by 100 years, and he was, his just those lists of the available materials were so copiously produced. The anguish is an interesting point because it's obviously he's a man standing on the cusp. He seems to like the systems, he seems to like the adulation, he likes the organization. He's deeply embarrassed and regretful about the treatment of certainly the body of the artist. He makes a plea, which I think there is an implicit plea in his work about it not being the artisan or the craftsperson, but the artist. And I think this is something that should really be up for consideration. And one of the things he did say, which I couldn't read out to you, is, quote, "We look upon our European brethren to teach us how to develop the resources of our country." So he's looking for systems, he's looking for mercantile display, and to continue with us the profits arising from it. This was, of course, the great Congress grounds about the dream of wealth. Neither should we think of them as intruders. This is a highly compromised position, nor should they think of us as mere hackers of wood and drawers of water. So the colonial position is extremely well articulated. TN Mukherjee is also unique. He doesn't have a cohort of curators or organizers of exhibitions. And we can see this duvidha, this dilemma in which he seems to be caught. And once he comes back, I think he turns with great relief to writing. 1889 or so, when he finishes his travel across Britain and Europe, he comes back to Bengal and writes in Bengali very copiously, and becomes once again a part of that literary society. Thank you.
Thank you, Gayatri. So we're going to open it up. Are there any questions for any of the three presentations? Yeah, Mayank and then Shila.
It's actually more a reflection of comment. Rashmi, since you left your presentation open, I wanted to contribute to the discussion the role of Aruna Vasudeva as a scholar, as a publisher, as an editor, an organizer of film, and also someone who established NetBack, which brought initiative. So just wanted to contribute with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the journal that she edited. Has been a very rich resource for all of us to study in this class. Yeah.
Thank you, all three of you, for your presentations. I have an observation just directed to Gayatri's presentation, which I really enjoyed. I'm one of those who knew Troy Lokanath Mukhopadhyay as a writer before I knew he was anything else. And as a writer of ghost stories, there's a fantastic ghost story called The Pearl Necklace on Tomala, where he talks. So there's a Betal, and we work a lot with Betals these days, and who describes himself as an off-time, off-rhythm character, and he addresses someone who's come across him as a skull. and says that, why are you knocking my skulls with the bones of other people? And I think that's a kind of museological question. And then this interrupted person is very surprised and says, what do you want from me? And he says, I'm a Vetal, my job is to ask riddles, and if you can answer, you're okay. Otherwise, you know what's going to happen to you. And he says, well, I'm a very simple person. I'm not with commodity. I cannot answer your questions. And he says, so if you can't pose riddles or tell stories, what you're doing dealing in skulls and bones. As an assistant curator of the Indian Museum, he would have been dealing a lot with skulls and bones and skulls and bones as actual objects, but also as sort of ideas and metaphors of the dead past and the kind of jumble of the past that museums always present. And they present them in terms of certainty and in terms of a narrative that unfolds a certain kind of progress. But I think, I'm not saying that Proto-curatorial Mukhopadhyay was self-conscious about this in his museological practice, but I'm taking his ghost story persona as a lesson for all of us, saying that if we can't answer or pose riddles or tell stories, why are we even doing what we're doing? That's all I can say.
May I respond to that? Because I think what TN Mukherjee does is, for us who don't read Bangla, he opens up the possibility of other kinds of investigations around bodies. For me, this was a very important question. The body as subject. Somebody pointed out that there are no male bodies. I think Girish talked about there are no male bodies in art. TN Mukherjee was concerned about the body, and I think this question actually hangs in the air. And it would have been appropriated by Gandhi, because Gandhi himself assumes the persona of the prime artisan figure or the artist figure because of his assumption of his way of dress. But then I think the person who can take this a little bit forward is Nandalal. I think Nandalal in the Haripura panels is actually an interesting answer to what do you do with the body of the artisan? How do you confer respect, equality, or rather, how does he become the subject of art? And he does that in the panels. There are ample examples of the terracotta maker, the weaver, etc., who are embodied within what was happening. And the fact that they stuck these 107, frames around the pandal, so that as you walked past, you saw that this was on Gandhi's instructions, this absorption of the body of the artisan and the body of the viewer in this kind of direct sort of engagement, I think actually offers a kind of an alternative to the kinds of questions that TN Mukherjee raises. It's a suggestion.
Anybody else? Gabor,
I was very intrigued by your presentation, Rashmi. I have a question which is somewhat, you could say, not historical misplaced. And it didn't go unnoticed that Gayatri used the word Duvidha. So it kind of refers to that with the kinds of films that were coming out in the 70s. Dharamava, Duvidha, and Satyu, Manigol. How did the film society's writing address these extremely sort of bright political issues at the time? Especially with reference also to 71. I'm just curious to know about that.
Yeah, I can only recommend reading Rachna Mazumdar and Cheryl's books for the long history of this, but there was a deep and great engagement, and not only in English, in so many languages. In fact, Indira Gandhi played an instrumental role, again, to go back to the role of the state in terms of permitting Garam Hawa to be screened. So I think it was a kind of strange relationship between state and the film society. We are, present where there is a strange relationship between the state and cinema of an entirely different kind. And I think trying to understand these imbricated histories of, because it wasn't an independent film cinema. There was actually quite a heavy involvement of the state in it. So, but it was a state in some sense which did permit some amount of debate and discussion at their will. So I think that's the kind of key distinction in terms of understanding the relationship between film production and the present governance, in which I feel that it is all the more important to look towards cinema and not dismiss it as a popular kind of realm, because we see that it is being leveraged in a very deliberate manner for political ends. So it's not just answering your question, but I mean, these debates were very intense and there were lots of differences of opinion. There's huge difference of opinion in terms of what is political cinema within filmmakers, and there are filmmakers in this movement. I want to actually respond to that as well. And so Ray's popularity, for example, fell in the 70s in some quarters, because his work was not seen as being political enough. But again, the work of a historian, a film historian, or art historian for that matter is, and personally, because we also deal, and we spoke about this in Bombay when we met, film studies people deal with the dearth of resources historically, as opposed to perhaps art historians who may have access to more carefully preserved archives in some sense. So the work of speculative historical reconstruction again plays a central role, and these narratives can be told in many ways. I think that it also ties in with the nature of film as a medium in some sense. Right? So the ending can end in multiple ways, depending on what the audience wants.
Yeah, Prendish. Yeah, just last question from Prendish, and then we one more. Oh my God,
Very quick.
Okay, so we'll do fast because then we'll cut into lunch.
Yes,
We're going to start the next panel
Sure,
probably in 3
Thanks. So my question would be to
No, one second. Prendish
you
first. You second and Jibesh third.
yes,
That's it.
sure. Okay, well,
Go for Prendish.
That's what this one.
Anybody else's? I think maybe the one here which is on.
Yeah, my question is to Nancy, and thank you for that commendable presentation and the exhaustive excavation of the exhibition histories you have done. As you said, to look at where one should not be looking, or to look at where the police history or the police exhibition histories tell us not to look. In this regard, I would also like to go back further, but also like Gayatri said about Gandhi, where do you locate or situate Gandhi? I feel that he is also one of the first curators in that way, especially the way he dealt with the Alpura conference and the entire exhibition. And also the figure of Anant for that matter, who is not seen as a curator, but as this dominant father figure of Indian art history and everything. So these two figures I was very curious to know.
Thank you, Prendish.
To that.
It's funny because I wrote a paper long ago about how Gandhi was a performance artist avant la lettre, because of his protest marches and the way in which he literally turned his protest into a theatre of action. And as you know, I've also written a lot about Kumar Swami's philosophy as well as his writing on the crafts. And taking that further, by looking at what Tagore was thinking in terms of the arts and crafts, and then, of course, totally encapsulating my, work for many years, and then from there to look at Ambedkar's, work. And what I've done through the years is basically to marry art history with questions of human rights, and therefore a lot of my writing, which is on Adivasi artists, but also Dalit artists. And since you're taking us back, like a flashback, I would also like to do a flash forward and talk about how, since Gayatri tried to finish her presentation during discussion, which is great. I don't have any problems, but I don't think Meera gave me that, favor. But I'd like to just do that anyways. That's okay. I thought, this is here, and there would be no question for my presentation anyway, so that's okay. So I'd just like to say that it was there was a kind of relay of ideas. When I, for example, look at all these figures, whether it's Kumaraswamy, Tagore, and then inserting figures like Ambedkar into art historical questions. In my own paper, for example, I talk about Pilu Puchkhanawala, I talk about Firoza and the lineage of the Vallabhbhai Desai Institute, and then Nalini literally picking up the baton and sort of continuing with that relay, and then doing the exhibition through the looking glass on women artists. And I'd like to pick up the baton from there and talk a little bit just about my women artist show, Woman is as Woman Does. So when I pick up the baton, I'm not just doing it in a nostalgic manner. When I was asked by Mr. Mukherjee of the CSMBS Museum to do a women artist show, my brief was to just, basically do a kind of spectacular show of 5, 6 major women artists. But I could not just do that. And I did not just want to show women artists of privilege. So I decided then to, see to it that if I showed a Nilima and a Shiva, Nilima's Binchampa grew up on dowry deaths or Shiva's protest photographs from the women's movement, then I would also show those practices alongside an Adivasi artist like Durgabai Vyam, who's dealing with a Dalit subject, the Bhimayan, biography of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, and then show Durgabai Vyam's practice parallel to Ranjita Kumari, who's an artist of Dalit heritage. And I have this photograph, which I've taken, which is now going to become part of my archive, where Durgabai Vyam is listening to the Gali Geet, a video by Ranjita Kumari, and it's about these transgressive songs which are sung by women of the Dalit community in Bihar. And she was really enjoying it. So it was not just my curatorial desire to show all these practices, in parallel with each other, but you could also see from when Durga Vyam came to visit the show, and I also did a workshop with her, she too was enjoying Ranjita Kumari's work. So in a way, there was a kind of validation of that curatorial desire.
Yeah, go.
Yes, thank you. Expecting answer from any of you, specifically to Nancy Adajania. If you remember, we had a workshop around the idea of Gol Ghar. I think
Yes.
that was a colonial setup, actually a kind of granary that happened around the Bengal famine, I think. So I think
you participated in the workshop?
Yes, I was there.
What's your name? Sorry.
Daya Hussain.
Of course, I remember.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
So though that was online,
Yes.
that was quite interesting. So to my own observation, I think curation is also more about how we are looking at the space. Not only what is inside the space, but how we are reacting with it, how the audience is reacting to the space, the infrastructure, and what is the relation between the viewer, the audience, the normal people around it, normal public, and that space. So in context of that Gol Ghar, and also in case of, as Partner has illustrated, in India and nationalism, I think, his text, the Prince of Wales, lunch and dinner in Elephanta Caves. They were organized there. There's an illustration, very interesting illustration there in his text. So, in contrast to that colonial setup and colonial, you can say, that way of thinking these spaces, how they exotically see these things. In contrast to that, when we look at the post-independence India, so around the educational setup, around the institutions, how we evolved in that sense. Do we have any indigenous curatorial aspect within the educational setups, around the art colleges, around the art institutions, the galleries and such things? How we evolved out of it? The colonial, it is about, I think, the binary way, Indian and Western, but as an indigenous setup and initiatives within the curatorial practices. And they too around the educational setups, within the art colleges. Thank you.
I think you should consider some of the initiatives, at least in Baroda, to work within the idea of the Meela. And the idea of the Meela is something that has, it has given a fair amount of impetus right from the early period. If you even look at, say, someone like Jyoti Bhai Bhatt, who's 90 years old now, and he's just had an exhibition, he refers back to the works that he would have made for the Meera, the fairs that they have for students, which would be, you would have a commercial aspect, they would have an interface with the larger community. The Sri Niketan would have already done this in Shanti Niketan with their crafts outreach. Now, but the question I think is public outreach or the indigenous only through the craft? I mean, what is the nature of the language? Is it a limited language or what we understand that the publics can understand and what we embed within the gallery is another kind of a language? So I think that some of the conversation today has veered towards the breaking of these kinds of so these are social barriers as much as they are artistic and intellectual barriers. So I think that is something that is certainly not embedded in the art education in a very dramatic or very in a very it's not something that that you have a very sharp and clear contour, but it seems like a byproduct of other forms of education.
Thank you.
Just two questions, one to Rashmi and one to Nancy. I think it may not be a bad idea to tease out the practice of gathering with an artist logic outside as an inherent practice of artists, rather than bring the curatorial to understand it. The reason is, and if you look at many parts of the world and now many histories, the artist gathering practice, like Samira Bose was saying that presently in Delhi and in all the practices that she was showing, that artist gathering practices is part of art practice. And you cannot write artists without that gathering practice. And even in very dominant art histories, whether it's Dadaism, so you cannot, it's all about the artist gathering. And there are micro practices all over East Asia. Now you can see almost the artist practice are dominant because of the documentary. So if you continuously bringing that into the curatorial, what problem is that like the Mela becomes the curatorial. Actually, Mela has a different history with an artist. So clubbing the curatorial as this kind of a gathering site and the artistic as the melancholic source is a mistake we're making in drawing these biographies. I think conceptually.
Yeah.
Because Pilu's biography seems to suggest a very vibrant idea of a sense of an associative density around them. And if we lose that associative density among artists imaginally, we may be actually losing a large amount of artist practice. That is one. It was just a kind of question. But to Rashmi, I was curious because of this phantom. Would you consider Ashish Radhash as a phantom curator because he makes the encyclopedia? But why am I saying is that the curator word is solving a problem and creating other problems. Solving a problem because it is able to bring a buzz into a discussion and a confrontation as a discussion, because I think we do not have that space in film history to produce that image. But it is also creating a problem because it is becoming such an unwieldy space that Ashish Adyaksha will very likely be seen as a curator plus curation. That is different.
I mean, I don't think Ashish will have a problem with being phantom at all.
You will.
Yeah, no, I mean, I get your point, but the thing is that cinema has always had a, or film theory, let's say, or film history has had a very difficult relationship with history per se, which I think has been more ably handled in the case of art history because of the manner in which history itself is understood, perhaps. And this is a speculative kind of thing that I'm saying with no great certainty. The second thing, as I mentioned, is that the dearth of resources, in some sense, that we are actually not in a position to reconstruct many of those histories. So there has to be a certain sense of phantomness and speculation that we're forced to kind of, resort to. Had that not been the case, I still wonder. I mean, the question that I ask is, does a more complete archive make for a more complete history? Right. And it is a question that I asked. Does it actually mean that we're in a better position to say with greater certainty that this was so and then this was so in that? So, yeah. No, I'd like to hear what you have to say, but I understand what you're saying in terms of, solving one problem and creating another. But that is like the Vikram and Betal story. So.
Yes, I just like to clarify one thing that I do not believe in this binary of the artist versus the curator. The artist is melancholic and then the curator is a confident figure. Because in practice that it never really pans out as such. And the reason why I talked about Pilu as a proto-curatorial figure is because she, in a way, realized that there was a need for such what you call artist gathering practices. Because it did not organically happen, and therefore Bombay Arts Festival to have this kind of a transdisciplinary exchange. And then again, it was felt in the 80s when sculpture was moving into the expanded field by Pushpamala, Ashish Rajadhyaksha and others. Ashish wrote the essay for the Bombay Arts Festival catalog or brochure, you can call it at that time. So it's one thing if these are artist gathering practices are organically growing and circulating. I completely agree with that. But the reason why I'm bringing the proto-curatorial figure here is because this need existed, but the platforms did not exist. So an artist behaved as a catalyst to bring together people who could then be part of these exchanges. So I'm just clarifying that.
Yeah, thank you very, very much, Nancy, Gayatri, and Rashmi, for your presentation. We will hope to come